Let me begin with our traditional warm greetings. Kamnamori meaning may you be blessed. And also I wish to take this opportunity to thank our organizers, our participants for giving me this opportunity to share once again the story, our story, the story of those on the front line of this impending climate change catastrophe and what it means to our people. The first question is, what has been the experiences of small island nations in the face of the impacts of climate change? Although my comments will focus primarily on Kiribati, the experience will be similar for other Pacific Island nations in the Pacific region. Besides being the largest expanse of water on the planet, the Pacific Ocean is also host to the largest collection of small island nations in the world. These nations are divided into three separate groups, based generally on their geographical location and according to the ethnic origins of their people. Micronesia are those islands in the central to the northwestern Pacific region. Melanesia are in the southwestern section, and Polynesia are located mostly in the southeastern sector. Some of these island nations are made up entirely of coral atolls, and some have a mix of high volcanic islands and the outer low-lying atolls with resident populations. An atoll island is simply a solid coral formation, usually below or at the high water mark, with an accumulation of coral sand and debris gathered together by constant wave action atop a submerged seamount. The narrow strips of land surround an almost enclosed lagoon and are on average about 2 meters above sea level and hardly ever more than 500 meters wide. Kiribati is made up of three groups of 33 atoll islands with a combined exclusive economic zone spread over 3.5 million square kilometers of the Central Pacific. It straddles both the equator and the international date line, and being in the doldrums is theoretically not prone to the tropical cyclones. Throughout my own lifetime, I am used to seeing storms, winds of around 30 to 40 kilometers per hour, and of course the occasional floods, waves overtopping the land, and erosion of the coastal areas. These events are regarded as a normal part of life on such fragile atoll islands. However, the severity and frequency of these normal events have gradually become more destructive. We now have village communities who have had to relocate due to the repeated flooding, and several more are in desperate need to find safer location due to the destruction of their food crops and their freshwater lands, and of course increasingly difficult living conditions. I am often asked what I consider to be a somewhat silly question. Have you seen any rise in sea level? I don't believe anyone can see a rise in sea level as one may do in a cup of water or a tank. And I believe that perhaps a much more relevant question would have been, have you experienced any changes in the severity of the impacts? And the answer to that is definitely a yes. During my 13 years in office, from 2003 to 2016, we as a government were always inundated by requests for assistance from communities seeking protection against erosion threatening their homes, community infrastructure, and the source of their livelihood. Some village communities also needed assistance in relocating from their once thriving communities. As a government, we also had to spend huge amounts of resources building seawalls to protect public infrastructure. But due to the limited resources available, government is unable to provide assistance for protecting private property. On the capital center, which is one of the most densely populated places on this planet, almost the entire shoreline on the ocean side of the island has been seawalled for protection. Otherwise, homes would have been eroded away. Over the last few years, there has been occasions when states of emergency had to be declared and assistance provided for communities on islands which had experienced severe floods, resulting in unprecedented damage to their homes, food crops, and ever so precious underground waterlands. In 2015, Tropical Cyclone Pam, after destroying the islands of Vanuatu, then veered northwards, seriously flooding all of the islands of Tuvalu, together with our islands in the Gilbert Islands group. We are outside of the cyclone belt, as I've said earlier, so this incident reflected a worrying departure from the normal weather pattern, a trend which I believe poses the more immediate threat to our future rather than the more gradual rise in sea level. Of course, both in combination would be devastating. As we were experiencing these events in Kiribati, other events were also unfolding in other parts of the world. Hurricane Katrina hit the southern East United States in August of 2005, resulting in destruction on a scale that which even the most developed country on the planet had difficulties dealing with. This was at the time when the United States was in denial of climate change. The chronic summertime bushfires kept burning the eastern United States and of course Australia. But so what? Heat waves of unprecedented intensity were sweeping across Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world, resulting in fatalities. The bushfires in California over the recent past are getting more destructive. In the summer of 2019-2020, the worst bushfires in Australia burnt 13 million acres of land and destroyed more than 2,000 homes. Here, in a country whose government has consistently denied the reality of climate change, and of course, early this year, they experienced the most devastating floods on their eastern seaboard. All of these events, together with the melting of the ice caps in the northern and southern polar regions, were once initially regarded as part of the normal annual cycle of events. But now that they are happening on a totally different scale, are beginning to sound alarm bells. The developed world, which once regarded climate change as not only inconvenient and irrelevant to their economic priorities and way of life, is now beginning to realize that climate change is not only a threat to those of us in low-lying island countries, and that the impacts of climate change are not confined to a rise in sea level. Initially, the science coming out of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was hesitant to assign responsibility for climate change to human activity, no doubt influenced by the powerful lobby by the fossil fuel industry. However, by the release of the fourth assessment report of the IPCC in 2007, there was a general consensus that climate change was indeed human-induced. Since then, the subsequent reports of the IPCC have simply reinforced its earlier findings, including the latest report released in February of this year, which indicated that the window for action is closing. And unless we as a global community can arrest the continuing rise in emissions and keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the future of humanity will be in serious jeopardy. However, for the small island countries, the fourth assessment report had already predicted that even if greenhouse gases were reduced to zero, the momentum of what is already in the atmosphere will continue to drive sea levels up, so that they would be uninhabitable within the century. The latest sixth assessment report has now given us until 2015 for the habitability of our islands. Against all of the foregoing litany of events, our experience in Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, and other low-lying countries in the Pacific, events unfolding in other parts of the world, successive IPCC reports with increasingly dire projections, what can the future scenario be for those of us on the front line? Over the last 2 decades, we have seen a growing momentum of climate action. But of particular note has been the active participation of the young people around the world. The defiant call shouted out by our young people during climate protest marches is, "We are not sinking, we are fighting." It is a cry of frustration, a cry of anger at the gross injustice of what is happening, but more so at the casual dismissal of the plight of those of us on the front line of climate change by the very privileged few who continue doing and benefiting from what science now confirms to be an attack on the future of our people, and indeed for all of humanity. It is a cry of anger, frustration, against the complicit acquiescence of those governments and administrations which have the capacity to remedy the situation, but instead have chosen to become willing participants in the immoral conspiracy in support of the fossil fuel industry. The Paris Agreement reached in 2015 seemed to offer hope of redemption, but the last meeting of the COP in the United Kingdom last year failed to deliver the remedies needed to avert our future demise. In the face of these challenges, what options do we have? I have always believed that our first option should be to retain the integrity of our home islands, and in doing whatever is necessary to ensure that our future generations will be able to continue to live on their home islands. But in order to adapt and to build the resilience necessary to survive these projected impacts, extremely radical adaptation measures would be needed, and these would require huge amounts of resources. However, based on my 2 decades of personal experience observing the lack of international response to effectively cut emissions and rejecting responsibility for our situation, I am reconciled to the reality that the greater sacrifice of providing with us with the resources needed to implement the adaptation measures required is unlikely to be forthcoming from the international community. This was confirmed at the recent COP meeting in 2021 in the United Kingdom, when once again the developed countries, including the United States and Australia, rejected any responsibility for the damages sustained by countries who have contributed to the least to the greenhouse gas emissions. It was therefore against this background that I proposed a multi-pronged approach, so that whilst giving priority to building our climate resilience, we should concurrently plan for the relocation of our people. I have been very conscious of the strong opposition by other Pacific Island leaders to the notion of relocation, seeing it as compromising our negotiating position in seeking compensation from those responsible for our problem. But I do not believe that the above options are mutually exclusive, and it is my view that we have to acknowledge the brutal reality that some of our people will choose to relocate, and that we will, if we are unable to build the necessary resilience, our people will one day have to relocate, whether we like it or not. Over the years, many of our people have been migrating as a matter of choice, mostly to Fiji, Australia, New Zealand, and even to the United States. More recently, under the New Zealand Pacific Access Category Scheme, there has been a steady outflow of our people migrating from the Pacific Island countries to New Zealand, taking up their annual country quota under the scheme. In Kiribati, we have our share of internal migration, mostly in search for better economic opportunities, resulting in over 50% of our 120 population residing in the urban center under extremely congested conditions. In the 1960s, under the British colonial administration, people from our drought-affected islands were relocated to the Solomon Islands, where they continue to live today as citizens. So relocation is not a new phenomenon for Kiribati, or indeed for the rest of the Pacific Island countries. Therefore, in acknowledging that climate-induced migration is inevitable, I had proposed that if and when our people relocate due to climate change, they must do so with dignity and not as climate refugees. Hence the genesis of the concept of migration with dignity. It is simply a proactive response to the inevitable reality involving the upskilling of our people through education and skills training to qualifications recognizable in their countries of destination, so that they can be gainfully employed and not become second-class citizens in their newly adopted communities without the proper and necessary preparations those of our people who migrate will indeed become climate refugees and will most likely be residing in the slum areas of the cities they move to. Migration with dignity, as I defined it, must also involve the preparation of the communities into which our people move to, in order to ensure smooth integration and avoid the instabilities experienced in communities with sizable migrant populations. The issue of sovereignty is also an actively debated aspect of the uncertain future facing the small island nations. Various formulations as to how and what will happen have been hypothesized. Can we relocate as an entire nation and establish our sovereign nation in another country? Not likely. It has also been suggested that we trade access into countries like Australia in exchange for control of our extensive and resource-rich exclusive economic zones. Another suggests the formation of compact-type arrangements along the lines of the existing arrangements between the islands in Micronesia and the United States, and those between some Polynesian islands and New Zealand in the South Pacific, where there is relatively free movement between these island countries and the partner countries. However, none of these options has ever been seriously discussed, as I suspect none of the potential destination countries have any real desire to take climate migrants on board. The reaction from the island countries has also been a clear rejection of the possibility of losing the sovereignty and an unequivocal desire to retain the integrity of their home islands. I believe that for Kiribati it is possible to generate the resources to build the resilience of some of our islands so that we can maintain our sovereignty and our cultural identity at least for the next few decades. Our fisheries resources support a multi-billion-dollar industry, and our deep seabed minerals have the potential to meet increasing demand for metals. In order to do so, we must seek more than the 10% of the value of the fish landed on the side of the wharf which we currently receive. With respect to the ongoing debate over the mining of deep seabed minerals, Kiribati, like other small island countries, will need to decide whether to protect the living organisms on the deep seabed or to protect the future of their people. I also believe that if these island countries are to be dissuaded or prevented from mining the deep seabed, then they must be duly compensated for not doing so. In the course of 13 years of my presidency, I was also involved in two somewhat controversial ventures. The first was the designation of the Phoenix Islands Protected Area in 2006, which was later inscribed as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 2008. It was at the time the largest marine protected area in the world, comprising more than 400,000 square kilometers, 11% of our exclusive economic zone, of the most fertile fishing grounds in the center of the Pacific Ocean. We closed this marine protected area from any extractive industry. The second was the purchase of more than 6,000 acres of land in Fiji in 2012. Regrettably, our current administration is now in the process of opening that marine protected area to fishing. But both initiatives, apart from being investments in sustainability of our fisheries resources, in real estate, and as potential safety net for future relocation, they were also very loud statements to the international community that the gravity of the challenge we face with climate change is indeed real and threatens our very future survival. Thank you.